Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
That Christmas morning began with the same old choreography my family had rehearsed for decades. The laughter that always felt too bright, the matching pajamas Mom forced us to wear for the photos, the smell of cinnamon rolls and expensive coffee that made everything look perfect, even when it wasn't. The fireplace crackled as if it had been waiting all year to perform, and in that glow, my sister Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, her blonde curls shining under the tree lights like she was in a Hallmark commercial. She was always the star of every family scene, the center of gravity that the rest of us somehow orbited around. When Mom reached under the tree and pulled out a small velvet box, everyone leaned forward instinctively. She smiled, the kind of wide, glowing smile that only appeared when Lily was involved, and said, "This one's for you, sweetheart." The way she said it, soft, emotional, almost trembling, told me before I even saw what was inside that it was something big. Lily opened the box slowly, drawing out the suspense as if she knew the cameras were watching. Inside was a gold key on a delicate chain, shimmering like a promise. Mom clasped her hands together. "It's the key to her new house," she announced, her voice cracking just enough to sound sentimental, not staged. "We wanted to surprise you, honey. You've been through so much, and we thought it was time for a fresh start." The room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Dad laughed loudly, raising his mug of coffee like a toast. "Our homeowner," he said proudly. Even Grandma, who usually sat half asleep in the corner, managed a weak clap. I sat on the couch, my cup of tea going cold in my hands, and watched the performance unfold. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more like déjà vu, the same familiar ache that came every time my sister's chaos was rewarded with generosity, while my stability was met with polite indifference. Lily had burned through jobs, boyfriends, and 2 engagement rings, and somehow every mistake made her more deserving of a new start. I'd built my life from scratch, quietly, without asking for help, and for that, I'd earned their admiration in theory, but never in action. Lily squealed and hugged Mom so hard the coffee nearly spilled. "I can't believe this," she said. "Where is it? Where's the house?" Mom giggled like a schoolgirl. "It's in Brookdale, near the lake. Remember that little white one we saw last summer? We closed on it last week. Your father wanted to wait until spring, but I told him Christmas was perfect." Dad nodded, proud of himself, his arms slung around Mom's shoulders like a man who had done something heroic. I could see the numbers in his head, the quiet satisfaction of being able to afford generosity. It was always about appearances with him, how kindness looked, not how it landed. Mom turned toward me finally, as if remembering I existed. "You'll get there too, Emma," she said warmly. "You're just independent. You don't need us the way Lily does." It wasn't an insult, but it felt like one. The words "you don't need us" were the most expensive kind of dismissal. I smiled faintly, nodded, and murmured something about how happy I was for Lily. Inside, something colder than jealousy settled in, a realization that this imbalance wasn't accidental. It was tradition. When gift time resumed, the pattern continued. Lily unwrapped boxes filled with perfume, gadgets, and clothes from brands I couldn't afford without guilt. I opened a sweater from last season's clearance rack and a lavender candle that smelled faintly of detergent. Dad handed me an envelope with a $50 gift card tucked inside. "So you can treat yourself," he said with a grin that tried too hard. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, stuffed with forced laughter and the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart like evidence. I stared at the flickering tree lights and thought about the irony, how we wrapped up gestures, called them love, and handed them out like proof that everything was fine. When Mom brought out champagne to toast new beginnings, I quietly slipped away to the hallway, where my coat hung on the rack. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain white envelope, no ribbons, no stickers, just a simple label in my handwriting, for Dad. I hesitated for a second, listening to Lily's laughter spill from the living room, then tucked the envelope under the lowest branch of the tree, right between 2 shiny ornaments shaped like hearts. The paper inside wasn't festive. No glitter, no family photo, no handwritten message about gratitude. Just a single document, folded neatly. It had taken me months to prepare, to make sure every line was airtight. I didn't expect gratitude or even understanding. I just wanted acknowledgement, finally, on my terms. When I walked back in, Mom handed me a glass of champagne and said, to family. I clinked glasses with her, the sound sharp and hollow. Lily held her key up to the light, smiling for another photo that would no doubt end up on Instagram with a caption about new beginnings. I raised my glass toward her, my smile steady. Congrats, sis, I said softly. You've really earned it. No one caught the tone beneath the words, the faint tremor of irony. But that was fine. The best revenge isn't loud, it's patient. I sat back, listening to them toast to Lily's future, while under the tree, my own little gift waited in silence, quiet and unassuming, just like me. And though no one noticed, I couldn't help but glance at the clock and smile faintly. It was still early. The day had barely begun. If you were to freeze that morning in a single frame, you would think we were a well-adjusted family with decent taste in coffee and matching flannel. Yet every gesture had a history attached to it, like a price tag that never quite peeled off. Because nothing in our house ever appeared by accident, and certainly not on Christmas, which had always been Mom's favorite stage for directing what she called togetherness, and what I, over time, learned to recognize as a lovingly wallpapered scoreboard. Where Lily's points glowed in gold while mine were counted in invisible ink, the kind you have to warm over a candle to see it all. I grew up inside that script, the one where Lily's car trouble turned into Dad's early morning rescue mission and my tire rotation became a lecture about independence. Where Lily's wrong career choice earned a new semester at a private certificate program and my study promotions were praised with a shrug and a reminder to stay humble, as if humility were a bill I needed to keep paying in exact change to prove I belonged at the table. It is funny in the way a bruise can be funny if you press it long enough, how quickly the brain files away 1,000 tiny exceptions as love. Because it is easier to call it love than to admit you are the quiet understudy in a family play that never needed you on stage unless the star had the flu. So I learned to applaud on cue, to laugh a second after the punchline, to hold my breath when the room turned toward Lily and exhale only after the applause ended, and I will admit there were years when that routine felt safer than the truth, because the truth always arrives with a bill stapled to it. When I left for college with a scholarship and 3 part-time jobs lined up for the first semester, I didn't know that the account labeled Education Fund, Emma, had already been chopped up to cover the emergency that wasn't quite an emergency. Lily's spectacular attempt at opening a boutique with a partner who believed spreadsheets were a suggestion, yet the ledger didn't lie, and when the bank statements surfaced later in my adulthood like bottles on a tide, each transaction date sat there unblinking, a row of little lights telling me exactly how the story had been written while I was out proving I didn't need help. By the time I built something stable, nothing glamorous, nothing that would make Mom's group chat erupt with confetti gifts, just a small, profitable services company with clients who paid on time and a year-end spreadsheet that made a satisfying kind of sense. I had also developed a habit of putting facts in a drawer and letting them cool, because hot facts make you impulsive, and I wanted to be surgical, not loud, which is how, 2 years ago, I noticed a parcel that had changed hands in a hurry. After a tax auction, a scruffy rectangle with more potential than curb appeal, a rectangle that happened, much later in the chain, to sit inside one of Dad's neat little assumptions about what would always be his by right. And I formed an entity with a name that would mean nothing to anyone except the person who taught me how to read deeds for fun on Sunday afternoons, Grandma, whose maiden name, tucked in a middle line of family stories, had become my favorite kind of needle, thin enough to pass through fabric without tearing it, sharp enough to make a point. So there we were, the fire throwing polite heat, Lily pressing the key between her fingers like a prayer bead while her fiancé angled for better light, Mom staging the champagne flutes as if the house itself were watching and grading her effort, and Dad, rosy with success and cinnamon, rehearsing a speech about resilience that would end with a gentle jab at me for liking the scenic route, when I decided to indulge in the sort of petty generosity that looks like kindness on Instagram and feels like justice in real life, because I had brought a second gift that morning, nothing big, nothing fancy, Just a thick card tucked into a basket of housewarming things: olive oil, a small cutting board, a candle that did not smell like detergent. And at the very top of the card, in clean serif text, sat the name of a philanthropic program that my company funds each December, a quiet thing that keeps the lights on at a women's shelter in Sunnyside, the program formally attributed to the foundation. Arm of my little business and legally named after my grandmother's maiden name, which of course is a name my father hadn't said out loud in years, but could never fail to recognize when it appeared on paper, because some names carry their own electricity. I watched his eyes catch on it when I handed the basket to Lily with a flourish that made even me laugh, a big sisterly performance of goodwill that would read beautifully in photos, and I explained, in the breezy voice of someone who has learned how to sound unthreatening, that every year I partner with the Whitcomb Trust to match donations for housing stability, and that in honor of Lily's big move the trust would cover a few months of rent for 3 women who needed a clean lease and a door that actually locked. And I swear the room dipped half a degree as Dad blinked at the name like a man seeing a ghost at noon. Not because the philanthropy offended him, he loves a good tax-deductible flourish, but because he knew, with that accountant's bone-deep certainty, that the Whitcomb name meant I had built something he had not audited, something sturdy enough to make promises without touching his wallet, and if he followed the thread far enough he would find himself standing at the edge of a rectangle on a map with my signature under it. Lily squealed about the basket. Mom hugged me with a mixture of pride and relief that I was being sweet. The fiancé filmed another angle that would become a story labeled, "Big Sis is actually an angel," and Dad, who has never believed angels carry briefcases, put his mug down harder than he meant to and stared just long enough for me to enjoy the smallest, neatest victory I had allowed myself all year, a victory that required no raised voice, no confession, no scene, only a card with a name, and the knowledge that the ground under his tidy definitions had shifted by a few degrees, enough to make him check the tree twice before he sat down again. I felt the balance tilt, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to clutch their pearls, but perceptibly, like the moment an elevator begins to move and your stomach remembers gravity, has a sense of humor. And I let the silence after my explanation breathe, because silence is where real things happen in my family, and I could see the question forming behind his eyes. How deep does this go? What else don't I know? Why does that name ring like a bell in a locked room? While Lily posed with her key and Mom arranged the ribbon tails as if presentation might fix the past, and when Dad finally looked up, our eyes met for the briefest second, and I gave him nothing but a pleasant, public smile, which in our private language meant everything he didn't want to translate. For all the years I had applauded on cue, this was me stepping a half-inch into the light without asking permission, and while it was not the kind of revenge you can pin to a corkboard with red string, it was delicious in its smallness, because it changed the air without spilling a drop, and if you think that is petty, then you have never had to survive on crumbs of acknowledgement handed out like prizes for not making trouble. So I let the moment sit, I let him taste the name and remember its owner, and as Mom passed the champagne, I clinked glasses with a sweetness that would play well in the family album while under the lowest branch of the tree the other envelope waited, and Dad, reaching for his refilled mug, shifted his eyes toward the presents as if something there had called his name, which, for today, was enough. The decision to turn an ordinary piece of paper into a weapon was not born out of rage, but from the quiet accumulation of small, unacknowledged humiliations that had fossilized over years of polite endurance. And perhaps that is what made it so precise, so cleanly executed that even I had trouble labeling it revenge. It felt more like a correction, a necessary adjustment in a household that had always operated according to an unwritten constitution where power was measured in gratitude, and gratitude was something I owed them simply for existing under their roof. I remember sitting in my apartment one night in early autumn, the first draft of the document glowing faintly on my laptop screen, the cursor blinking like a metronome measuring the pace of my hesitation, and realizing that this was the first time in my life I was writing something my parents would have to read on my terms. The city outside was already sleeping, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the kind of Ordinary domestic sound that feels almost conspiratorial when you are doing something irreversible. The document itself was neither long nor complicated. It didn't need to be. It was a transfer notice, straightforward in language and almost boring in its lack of emotion. The sort of paper no one reads twice unless it concerns them personally, and this one did. It referenced a property, a parcel my father had once sold off in haste to cover Lily's failed business debts, later bought back under a new entity, my entity, for less than half the original price. He had written it off as a family sacrifice, another act of benevolent rescue. He never imagined that the same land, sitting quietly under a corporate name he didn't recognize, would become the hinge of our story. I had learned to be careful, to document everything with timestamps, notarizations, and signatures, because people who grow up invisible learn early that proof is their only ally. The day I finalized the deed transfer, my lawyer friend Mark, a man who understood revenge as an administrative art form, asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with it. I told him it wasn't about taking something from them. It was about owning what had already been taken. He nodded, the way only another eldest child would, and said he'd make sure everything was clean, no loose ends. I spent the rest of that afternoon rereading the final draft, marveling at how sterile justice looks on paper, no drama, no shouting, no applause. Just dates, numbers, and a single signature that tilts slightly to the right because my hand always shakes when I'm calm. The night before Christmas Eve, I drove back to the house I had avoided for months, the familiar route winding through quiet streets strung with lights that looked too innocent for what I carried in my bag. Every radio station played carols, every front porch glowed with warmth, and yet inside me there was only a heavy, deliberate stillness. I parked 2 blocks away so no one would see me arrive, stepped out into the cold, and stood for a long time staring at the house where I had learned to speak softly and leave rooms quietly. The windows were golden with lamplight, and I could see silhouettes moving inside, Mom fussing over ribbons, Dad checking the thermostat, Lily probably rehearsing her smile. For a moment, I almost turned back. It would have been easier to keep the illusion intact, to keep pretending that fairness was something that could be earned by patience. But illusions age poorly, and this one had reached its expiration date. When I finally stepped inside, Mom greeted me with that mix of warmth and mild surprise that always made me feel like an unexpected guest rather than a returning daughter. She smelled of cinnamon and perfume, the expensive kind she saved for holidays. "You made it," she said, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "We didn't think work would let you go." I smiled and said something non-committal about catching an early flight. Dad appeared from the kitchen, glass of bourbon in hand, his cheeks already flushed. "There's my independent girl," he said, the words sliding easily off his tongue, polished by years of repetition. I wanted to ask if he ever wondered why independence was always the word he used instead of love. Later that evening, after the laughter and the dinner and the careful performance of closeness, I sat at the dining room table while everyone drifted towards sleep. The house was finally quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint whistle of wind against the windows. I pulled the envelope from my bag, laid it flat on the table, and ran my fingers over the seal. It felt strangely alive, as if it knew the weight it carried. I slipped it under the stack of Christmas cards Mom had arranged for the morning, right where Dad would find it. There was no note, no explanation, just his name written in clean black ink. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the tree, at the glittering ornaments reflecting tiny fragments of light, and realized how much power silence can have when it's earned. For years I had spoken in careful half-sentences, learned to sound agreeable even when the air inside me was screaming, but now every word I hadn't said had condensed into this single act. It wasn't anger, it was release. Outside, snow began to fall softly, the kind that muffles sound and makes the world feel paused. I watched it for a while through the window, then whispered to the empty room, "Merry Christmas." The drive back to my apartment felt weightless, almost dreamlike. The roads were empty, and the streetlights cast long silver shadows across the snow. For once, there was no tightness in my chest, no restless rehearsing of future arguments. Whatever came next, confusion, denial, fury, it would be theirs to carry. I had already done my part. The truth, once printed and sealed, doesn't need defending. It just waits to be opened. And in the morning, when Dad would sit under the tree, surrounded by the people he had trained to believe in his version of fairness, he would open an envelope and discover that his story no longer matched the paperwork. Morning arrived with that polished brightness my mother curated like a brand, the kind of brightness that made every surface gleam and every flaw look intentional. And while the coffee machine sang its cheerful little song and the cinnamon rolls exhaled their sugar into the house as if goodness could be baked and served, I took my place on the end of the couch where the wreath light hit the tree just so, because I wanted a clear line of sight to the lower branches where the white envelope waited like a small, patient animal that trusts the trap will spring without any help from you. Lily performed her enthusiasm with professional efficiency, holding up the gold key so the tiny stones around the bow could catch the light in a way that would translate on camera, and her fiancé, who had never known a real silence in his life, narrated from behind his phone while Mom dabbed the corners of her eyes and Dad delivered little jokes with the relaxed confidence of a man who believes the scene belongs to him, which, to be fair, it always had, at least until paper started to matter. There is a particular quiet that falls before a necessary thing happens, a hush the room does not consciously agree to but cannot resist. And I felt that quiet tighten around the edges when Dad began his ritual of distributing gifts according to his table of categories, the system he swore kept everything fair. Even though fairness in our home had always been a trick mirror that elongated one person and shrank another, he handed Lily a box heavy enough to be important, then passed me a pale blue sweater that would look fine in photographs, but had the exact texture of an obligation, and I smiled the way guests smile when the host has done his best, because guests are who I had been trained to be here. It took another round of laughter, another clink of glasses, another performative hug caught by the fiancé's camera before Dad finally reached for the small pile at the base of the tree, and my breath, despite all my rehearsing, pulled tight in a way that made me suddenly aware of every rib in my body. He picked up the envelope with the same mild curiosity he'd devote to a bill that might carry a discount if paid on time, turned it over to examine the seal as though the seal might confess a secret, and then slid a thumbnail under the flap with the casualness of a man expecting another sentimental card from his daughter who likes simple things, yet the first line, which had been chosen precisely to rearrange his blood, did its work the moment his eyes landed on it, and I watched in almost scientific fascination as color drained from his face the way weather drains from a sky right before the thunder remembers its assignment. Mom noticed first because she always watched him before she watched anyone, her hand stilling over the ribbon she had been smoothing, and Lily, who reads rooms the way she reads contracts, only after a crisis, leaned in with a performative gasp that died halfway to performance when she understood this was not content, this was consequence. If I tell you his hands shook, I am being poetic. They did not, because he had spent a lifetime disciplining his hands, but the paper made the smallest crackle as he tightened his grip to keep it from betraying him. And in that sound I heard every time he had talked over me, every time he had tallied up my self-sufficiency as proof that love was better spent elsewhere, every tidy moral he had wrapped around Lily's emergencies to make them look like courage. And I felt a wave of something that was not triumph. Triumph is loud, and I needed this to be quiet, but rather relief, the kind of relief that arrives when a tooth finally loosens and stops pretending it will hold forever. He reread the first line, then dropped his gaze farther, scanning the crisp blocks of text, the parcel number that would ring a bell he thought he had hidden in a different attic, the words right of possession and recorded transfer, and the unassuming sentence indicating notice of intended action should voluntary compliance not occur by a stated date that arrived sooner than spring, and although the law is emotionally illiterate, it knows how to draw a horizon that cannot be ignored. "What is this?" he said, but the words were not a question so much as a ritual attempt to reassert authorship, and I let the silence after them expand before I answered, because I wanted him to hear the neighborhood through the walls, the distant plows, the small thuds of snow falling from eaves, the life that would continue regardless of whether he liked what the paper allowed. Then I said, in a voice as even as the line my pen had made beside my name, that it was a notice pertaining to property he had once assumed would orbit him forever, and that it had been handled properly, and that if he needed a translation I could recommend someone who did not drink bourbon before noon. Mom sat down as if the couch had been moved 2 inches to the left when she wasn't looking, and Lily clutched her key so tightly the delicate chain left a neat crescent on her palm, while the fiancé, confronted for the first time with a scene that would not obey a caption, lowered his phone like a man who has accidentally filmed the ground. He tried to marshal an argument, because arguments are what he loves and also what he trusts, and he began with the familiar openings: "This is family. This is unnecessary. This is not the time." Yet the words skidded on the ice of the document's specificity, because paper is a kind of weather no umbrella can manage, and when he turned to me with that look that had once reduced me to shape and temperature, I did not look away, which, in our private grammar, wrote a sentence no one wanted to read aloud. "You cannot be serious," he said finally, and I told him seriousness was the only language the county office ever learned, that dates were serious and signatures were serious and history, recorded correctly, was the most serious thing of all. Mom pleaded toward fairness, as if fairness were a pie you could cut differently if you found a sharper knife, promising conversation and compromise in a tone designed to make me feel ungenerous, while Lily accused me of sabotaging her happiness with timing that bordered on cruelty. And I let their words pass through me like wind through a fence, because I had spent too many holidays acting as wind chimed to their gusts, and I was finished making music for weather I did not choose. So I placed my empty coffee cup gently on the coaster, thanked Mom for the roles that were, as always, perfect, and told Dad he would find the relevant contact information on the second page, along with the deadlines his accountant would appreciate. Then I stood, because standing is sometimes the only revenge people like us are allowed to show. On my way to the hallway, I paused by the tree and adjusted a heart-shaped ornament that had been bumped askew, a ridiculous little grace I gave the moment so I would not remember it only for the sound of paper, and when Dad said my name I turned. But I did not move closer, which felt like breaking a very old rule written in chalk across childhood and refreshed every December, and he asked, in a voice that would have been gentler if he still had the power to win, whether I understood what this would do to the family, and I said I understood the family had already done it to itself, and I was simply keeping the books honest. That was the last sentence spoken before the front door framed me. Winter pressed its clean palm to my face, and the house behind me swallowed the kind of silence that does not end when the door clicks. I walked to my car without looking back, because looking back is how you get written into the wrong story again, and as the engine warmed I checked my phone, saw the email confirmations lined up like obedient soldiers in my inbox, and felt the steady, unspectacular satisfaction of a lever finally moving the weight it was built to move. I drove until the neighborhood dissolved into salt-streaked avenues and shuttered storefronts, and then, because habits die harder than people think, I pulled into the lot of the coffee place where I used to do tax season side gigs for neighbors who paid in gratitude and banana bread. And I sat there with the engine idling while the foam hiccuped in the cup holder and thought about how victory never looks like the movies say it does, because no orchestra swelled, no triumphant monologue arrived. Only the soft tick of the cooling dashboard and the realization that the thing I had wanted for years, recognition, was not a trophy, but a ledger line finally balancing without someone rewriting the columns. I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone to narrate the moment, because I have learned that narrating your own justice makes people treat it like gossip, so I simply sent 2 messages to 2 inboxes that had been waiting. One to Mark confirming that service of notice had been effected and any response should be directed through him, and one to the Foundation's director authorizing the release of the midwinter grant to the shelter in Sunnyside with a note that read, in the bland language of philanthropy that I secretly adore for its lack of sentimentality, that additional funds would be available contingent on the success of certain real estate transitions expected in the first quarter, which, as jokes go, was dry, but I laughed anyway. Hours later, after the sun slid down and the sky squared its shoulders for night, my phone lit with a number that belonged to a man who used to decide whether my weekends were free. And I answered, because avoidance seems powerful until you need proof that you are not afraid, and his voice arrived without bourbon for the first time that day, carefully composed, asking if we could talk somewhere that wasn't the driveway or the past. And I told him there was a park by the river with benches that never judged, and we met there under lamps that made winter look almost cinematic, and the conversation began with the predictable preface: he didn't know, he hadn't understood, things had been complicated. And I let him speak because people like him confuse silence with opportunity. Then I put the document on the bench between us, flattened it with 2 fingers, and explained, not cruelly but precisely, that he had not been blindsided so much as finally forced to read the footnotes, and the footnotes had always said that the parcel he pawned to salvage Lily's mess had been reacquired with my earnings and held by an entity that owned not only the dirt, but the easement, the little legal throat through which utilities and driveways breathe. And that the plan I had filed was not a demolition order or an eviction, but a reallocation of leverage, because leverage is the only language anyone in our house truly learned. He stared at the map like it could beg for mercy, and I could see him trying to solve it the way he solved everything, with a check or a lecture or a dinner where the bill arrives before the apology. And I told him I was not closing the road to the beloved house or cutting pipes like a movie villain, that the notice merely triggered a negotiation wherein the use of what he thought was naturally his would be leased, sensibly and at market rate, to the family trust that I had revived under a name he could both recognize and respect, and that the lease receipts would not travel to my pocket in some cartoon of revenge, but would fund the foundation that kept doors open for women who had run out of quiet places to stand. And at that his breath left him in a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so tired, because even he could see the joke written in tidy lines. The access to Lily's bright new future would pass, each month, through the account of the daughter who was always told she didn't need anything. He wanted a bargain, of course, a softening of terms, a friendly rate anchored in memory rather than math, and I said I could meet him halfway if he could finally say the whole sentence I had been owed since the day my college fund took a detour. Not the sugar-coated version about hard times, but the unvarnished admission that he chose Lily's problems because he enjoyed solving them, and he chose my competence because it asked nothing of him, and although he did not love ultimatums, he loved losing even less. So he said the words, slowly, imperfectly, with little pauses that sounded like someone tugging at a knotted shoelace, and I nodded because it was not beautiful, but it was honest. And we shook hands on a number he would have called insulting yesterday, and will call fair next month when he tells the story to himself with the pronouns adjusted. Weeks followed in the orderly chaos that accompanies paperwork with teeth, emails threaded like beads, a site survey in mud boots, a frost-stiff clipboard, a neighbor who wanted to know if the construction would disturb her dog, and a brief clipped meeting in Lily's sparkling new kitchen where the marble reflected my face like I was a character in someone else's renovation show, and she accused me of monetizing access to her happiness while I explained, with a smile that did not make it to my eyes, that access had been monetized long before I arrived and I was merely routing the tolls towards something that would outlast granite. Her fiancé filmed his phone with his face and then remembered to put it down. The first lease payment came in a modest wire that looked like any other deposit except for the memo line where the accountant, who had no idea she was writing poetry, typed easement rental, and I forwarded the receipt to the foundation without ceremony. Then took myself to dinner. At the diner that still smells like onions and optimism, where the waitress with the soft voice slid me a slice of pie as if she knew exactly what kind of day I'd had. One evening near the end of January, when the sidewalks were a choreography of puddles and grit and the river carried chunks of ice like stubborn memories, I found a letter in my mailbox addressed in my father's precise, slightly old-fashioned hand. The kind of handwriting that makes even a grocery list look like a contract, and I took it inside and stood by the kitchen counter for a long while before opening it, because I understood that some doors, once opened, cannot be politely shut again. When I finally slid the blade under the flap, the paper inside made a sound like a light switch, and I read the first line, and then the second, and then stopped, not because it was cruel, but because sometimes clarity is a heavier weather than fog. And I folded the page and placed it in the drawer beside the lease copy and the deed and the recipes I keep from Grandma, and I told myself, with the calm of someone who has learned to trust the clock, that not every truth has to be consumed the second it is served. On my way to bed, I paused at the window where the city hummed its indifferent lullaby, and I thought about keys and roads and who gets to name things, and I pressed my palm to the cold glass and whispered, not a prayer and not a victory speech, just a promise to keep the books clean, even if nobody thanks me for it, because sometimes the kindest way to love a family is to take your hands off their illusions and let the number speak, and if next Christmas brings an apology or a new argument or nothing at all, the driveway will still be open, the lights will still work, and the shelter in Sunnyside will have another month covered, which is as close to peace as I have ever learned to get.